To our live on Facebook, YouTube, and all the other platforms as we are streaming this to you. Tonight we're going to be talking about the differences between the 601 and 701 version of the Security Plus exam. As we're talking, feel free to throw your questions in the comments. I have a short presentation we're going to go through first to give you an idea of the differences between those two. And then we're going to take all your questions about the upgrade process, whether you should take 601 versus 701, whether you should take the new version or the old version, if you're already halfway through studying, and all the other questions that I know you guys have out there. So we'll take care of all of that. And any other questions you have about anything else in general, feel free to ask them now. Throw them in the chat as I'm talking. I have my assistant, Christina, over here, who's one of our social media managers. She's going to help by collecting all of those. And I also have Jamario Kelly with me, who's one of our instructors. And we're going to go ahead and answer all those questions throughout our time together tonight. We'll be going for a while because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of questions on this one because Security Plus is such a popular exam. And there's a lot of questions about it. So that being said, I'll open the floor real quick to Jamario if he has any questions or concerns. If not, I'm going to take him off the screen and bring on my slides and start my presentation. So Jamario, any opening words before we get started?
Nope. Take it away, Sensei. That's what I like to call you. That's my new term for you now.
Yo. And just a real quick check. If you can hear me, just say yes or thumbs up or something in chat so I can make sure everybody can hear me and see me before I start going on a long diatribe, because that would really suck if you all tell me 10 minutes in that you can't hear me. Can anyone hear me out there? Yes. All right. Alex says he can hear me. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is the Security Plus 701. For those of you who aren't aware, the Security Plus 701 did just come out back on November 7th, which was last week. And CompTIA Security Plus is a global certification that validates the fundamental cybersecurity skills necessary to perform core security functions and pursue a career inside of IT security. Now, with CompTIA, every time a new exam comes out, they have what's called the overlap period. And during this overlap period, you could take the old version or the new version. And so as of November 7th, when you go to sign up for your Security Plus with Pearson VUE, it will ask you, do you want to take the 701 or do you want to take the 601 exam? Now, one of the questions I often get is, if you go to diontraining.com/vouchers and bought your voucher from us, is that a 601 voucher or a 701 voucher? And the answer is yes, it's both. When you buy a voucher from us, it is valid for that exam, meaning Security Plus. But when you go to sign up to take your exam, you can take either version of the exam. The same thing is true with A+. You can use the same voucher for Core 1 or Core 2, the 1101 and 1102, or the new version when it comes out, which will be 1201 and 1202, which comes out in about a year and a half from now. Same thing with Network Plus when that renews, and any of the other ones. So if you buy a voucher, it's always good for that exam type, such as A+, Net Plus, Security Plus, and it's valid for any of those two versions that are available at the time if you're taking it. So that'll bring up the question of which should I take, 701 or 601, and we'll talk about that as we go through today. If you are planning on taking the 601, please note that if you're taking it in English, you have to complete the exam and any retakes you may need by July 31st of 2024. That is about 6.5 months from right now. And the reason they have it laid out that far out this time is because they wanted it to be after the fall and spring semesters of college, because so many colleges use Security Plus as one of their courses. If you're one of my Western Governors University students, you know that this is one of your courses, is to take Security Plus. And most colleges are still teaching the 601 version because there wasn't textbooks available until last week. There wasn't courses available until last week. And so for that reason, a lot of people are still taking 601. My preference is actually to take the 701. It's a newer exam. It's a better exam. There's newer content on it that you're going to be covering and things like that. But if you're already like halfway through your studies, you'll probably just want to finish out with 601 because you're already halfway through studying. Or if you're in a college class that's tied to 601, then you'd want to take 601 as well. And we'll talk more about that as we go through as well. All right. The overlap period is about 6.5 months, as you saw those dates on the screen there. Right now, 701 is available. It's been available for about 5 days, and it will continue to be available for about 3 years. So we'll expect that the new 801 will be coming out in 2026, November of 2026. So you'll have at least until then to take 701, but 601 will be retiring next summer, July 31st. All right. All right. Where does Security Plus fit inside the CompTIA hierarchy of certifications? Well, CompTIA in their cybersecurity pathway, which is the majority of their certifications fit into this area, starts out with IT fundamentals. Then it goes to A+, which is hardware and software. There's 2 exams for that. Then it goes into Network Plus, and then it goes to Security Plus. And so we're covering the foundations, the hardware, the software, and then we go to networks, and then we cover cybersecurity. And then from there, we break apart and go blue team or defense on CISA, and red team or offensive on pen test. And then they come back together for a CAS Plus. Now, later in 2024, about this time next year, CAS Plus is going to have the new version coming out, and they're actually changing the name. So CAS Plus will now be called Security X, which is their security expert certification, and that'll be replacing CAS Plus next year. But what we're talking about today is Security Plus, and as you can see, it's kind of the beginning of the cybersecurity piece. Once you finish your fundamentals, your hardware and your software and your networking, you get to your entry-level cybersecurity, and that's what we're talking about with Security Plus. And then we go intermediate, and then we go advanced, and that's what you're seeing here. All right. When we talk about cybersecurity in the job market, why is Security Plus so popular? Security Plus is probably one of the number one IT certifications that people go for because it is so well tied into the cybersecurity field at this fundamental level. So I'm going to try to speak a little slower too. I just saw in the chat, Matt says he's used to hearing me at 1.5, and I probably sound like I'm talking 1.5. That's my natural speed. And normally when I record, I try to force myself to slow down. And I just realized I was talking way too fast in this live stream. So if I keep talking too fast, just Christina's sitting next to me, she'll just slap me. You'll see a hand coming from the side. So when it comes to the cybersecurity job market, what does the job market look like these days? This is a question I get a lot from students. Well, right now, there's 4.7 million people who are hired inside of what we call the global cybersecurity marketplace. That is the workforce that we have right now. In addition to the 4.7 million that are currently working there, companies are telling us they have 3.4 million jobs that they need to fill, and they can't find people for it. So almost double the amount of jobs that are being filled need to be filled again. And so there's a lot of demand here in cybersecurity. The global cybersecurity market is expected to grow from 155 billion in 2022 to 376 billion by the end of this decade, which is 2029, about 6 years from right now. And so that's almost doubling what we have more than doubling what we have in the current cybersecurity industry. And when we talk about the cybersecurity market, we're talking about consulting, we're talking about software, we're talking about pen testing services. All that stuff gets rolled into the cybersecurity bundle. And then of the organizations with a shortage of cybersecurity staff, 43% of those surveys said the biggest cause is not being able to find enough qualified talent. And I know when I say that, everyone who's been looking for a job is going to go, what about me? I'm ready for a job. And as I've told you all before, the certification is your key to an interview, but it's not your key to a job. People are looking for your certifications. They're looking for your experience and your technical know-how, and sometimes your degree if you have one or not. But generally, it's the certification on your resume is what's going to get you in front of a person to then prove you have the knowledge to be able to do the job. Entry level into cybersecurity is probably one of the hardest places. Once you get that first job, the doors just swing wide open. But getting that first one is really, really difficult. And it's not just as easy as saying, hey, I got my Security Plus, give me a job. So I want to be upfront with you all there. Security Plus is one of the steps you need, but it's not going to be the only thing. If you have your Security Plus and no experience and nothing else, probably you're not going to have a good time finding a job, right? Because all you have is a certification. But a certification combined with other things does have a lot of value, and that's what we're going to be talking about here. Security Plus job role stats. So in 2023, of the current open positions out there, as of last month, 86,000 jobs were requiring or requesting Security Plus. So it shows you that employers like Security Plus and they want Security Plus. And that's why I said it needs to be on your resume if you get it, because that will help in the filtering system through the applicant tracking system to help your resume get pulled out and put in front of a cybersecurity hiring manager for a chance that you'll get employed. The second thing I want to pull out is that one of the stats that CompTIA likes to tout is that the median pay, which is basically the average for simplification here, is $80,000 per year here in the United States. Now, the one thing I will caveat that with is that includes everybody who has a Security Plus certification in their job role. So, for example, I hold a Security Plus. I make more than $80,000 a year. I know other people who have a Security Plus and they're making $40,000 or $50,000 a year because they're working as a tier 1 engineer in the help desk or something like that. And so, their 50 and my, let's say 110 equals out to 80 overall as an average. And so when you see a number like this where they say, oh, it's $80,000 median pay, just remember that's actually probably a little high because there's higher people skewing it upward as well. Because a lot of people get their Security Plus. They've now been in the industry for 10, 15 years. They're making $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 a year, and they're in that figure as well. And so you have these entry-level people making 20, 30, 40, 50, and you've got some people making 150, 175, 200. And so your average overall is $80,000. And then the third thing I want to talk about is that of the total employed cybersecurity workforce in the United States, 24% have their Security Plus certification. And now that actually is a fairly low number when I look at that. And the reason I say that's low is because in the DoD environment that I came from, the military environment, everyone pretty much had their Security Plus because all of our military, all of our contractors, and all of our civilians were required to have their Security Plus to work in IT. So it's very heavily used in that industry. In the civilian sector, it's well respected, but not every job is going to require it. A lot of them will request it or recommend it, but they won't require it. And so that's why you see that it's only 24%. The other thing that drags this number down is you have a lot of people who have a lot of experience coming out of places like the military or hospital systems or universities that may not have a certification, or they've let their certification expire because they may have gotten it back in 2007 and they don't need it anymore because now they've got 10, 15 years of experience. So take these numbers with a grain of salt, but it's something I want to bring out and just let you know what the state of the market is. And so that's what we were talking about here. All right, so Security Plus 701, what is it and why is it different? Well, Security Plus is this global certification that's going to validate your fundamental and foundational cybersecurity skills that are necessary to perform security functions and those core security functions as you're trying to pursue an IT cybersecurity career. Generally, people are coming into Security Plus that have already worked in the help desk for a little bit because they have their A plus and Net plus, or they're working as a system administrator because they have their A plus or Net plus, or they're working as a network administrator and they have their Network plus. And then they're now moving into security, which is why they're now getting Security Plus. This helps you to launch a successful career. It helps you to assess your on-the-job skills. And it helps you to embrace the latest trends because every 3 years we update these certifications and we cover all the new things. So some of the newer things that are being covered in more depth in Security Plus are things like the cloud, virtualization, Internet of Things devices, real-time operating systems, embedded systems, programmable logic controllers, and all these things that really weren't covered in depth in earlier versions that are now much more important in today's environment, and so we're covering them. In 501, they just first started talking about the cloud and virtualization. In 601, they went a little bit further, but these days, you really can't operate a network without understanding the cloud and virtualization, and so there is more coverage of that in this certification, and so you'll see that as we go through it as well. All right. The next one we're going to talk about here is core cybersecurity skills. And 701 is really focused on those core cybersecurity skills. And this is something, if you've been in this industry for a little while, I know most of you are probably newer to the industry, but I can tell you that between 501, 601, and 701, there's been this transition. With 501, it was a much more in-depth technical certification. And then in 601, they removed it and made it much more foundational because we now had CISA and pen test as more in-depth cybersecurity certifications. And when 501 first came out, those certifications didn't even exist yet. So that was one of the reasons why it was more in-depth. In 601, they took out a lot of that content and brought it into Pen Test Plus and CYSA Plus, and then left more of the foundational at Security Plus 601. Now, as we go into 701, they've brought some of that back down into Security Plus. So there is still entry-level SOC analyst work being done, entry-level forensics being done, and things like that. But they've now made, with version 3 of CISA and version 2 of Pentest, they've made those more in-depth. And originally, when those came out, they were a 2 to 3 year requirement. Now they're looking more 3 to 5 year of experience. And with Security Plus, we're still talking about a 1 to 2 year experience area. So you'll find that 701 is a little more technical than 601 was in some areas, but then it's also much more generalist in other areas. But it's a really good foundation because they're trying to build this foundational cybersecurity knowledge base. So that's what we're looking at here. The certification covers things like assessing the security posture of an enterprise environment and recommending appropriate security solutions. Now, what that is a really fancy way of saying, if I tell you there's a vulnerability, like an SQL injection is happening, you should be able to tell me, how do I prevent that? Well, I can prevent that by using input validation. I can prevent that by using something like a web application firewall. That's what that first bullet really means. The second thing is monitoring and securing hybrid environments. This is what I was talking about with the cloud, mobile, Internet of Things, operational technology like ICS and SCADA, and all of that is being covered here in 701. We're also talking about operating with an awareness of your applicable regulations and policies like GDPR, governance, risk and compliance, doing risk assessments, doing audits, and all of that kind of stuff. And we're also talking about how you can identify, analyze, and respond to security events and incidents, basically entry-level SOC analyst type work before you move into CISA. And that's really what we're talking about here with Security Plus. Now, the other thing that they've added was about 20% of the content from 601 to 701 has been changed. Some of it, as I said, went down. Some of it went up into more depth. And this was really focused on current trends and hybrid environments. So things like, what are the latest threats and attacks and vulnerabilities that we're seeing? How is automation being used? How is zero trust being used? And all that kind of stuff. And then also, as I said, that hybrid environment of on-premise, cloud, IoT, and ICS SCADA or OT technologies. And that's really the big focus there. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about here is how are they different? And this is a question I get asked all the time whenever a new exam comes out is, hey, how is 701 different from 601? Well, as you can see at the bottom there, there's this chart, and it's going to show you the two areas of domains. On the right is what we had in 601. We had threats, attacks, and vulnerabilities. Those actually migrated directly from domain 1 into what we now call domain 2 with threat, vulnerabilities, and mitigations, which is really threats, attacks, and vulnerabilities. Then we had architecture and design, and that moved over to what we call security architecture. We had one called implementation, and that got removed pretty much completely, and some of the objectives underneath it got moved into other areas like architecture and design, or now we call it security architecture. We had operations and incident response. That got moved into what's called security operations, and you'll see governance, risk, and compliance got moved into what we call security program management and oversight. You'll also see there was a new domain added, which is called domain 1, general security concepts. And so if you're in my 701 course, you're going to see that we cover a lot of the domain 1 stuff in the first couple of sections because we're covering things like confidentiality, integrity, availability, the AAAs of security, encryption, and things like that are all fundamental knowledge. And then we apply those in threats, vulnerabilities, and mitigations, in security architecture, in security operations, and in our governance, risk, and compliance, which we now call security program management and oversight. So that's really the way that this thing moved. Also, one of the things you'll notice if you do a line-by-line comparison is we used to have 35 objectives in the old 601. We now only have 28 objectives. So we've lost 7 objectives, but a lot of that was because of combining and some things that were removed. And we also had job roles that were decreased. We used to have 8 job roles that were being covered by Security Plus because, again, a lot of that was kind of CISA type work. And so they pulled some of those out and re-scoped it down to only 5 job roles. So we can really focus in on what Security Plus should be, which is a more entry-level security certification to get you into the industry so then you're ready to move into CISA or pen test later on as you move up in your career. So that's where we are right now. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is the job roles. So as I said, we went from 8, which is on the right side of your screen under 601, over to only 5 in 701. You'll see that we had the systems and security administrator, which are our primary roles. Those stayed the same and got brought over. And then our secondary roles were things like a help desk manager or analyst. We took away the help desk manager. It's now just a help desk analyst. We had a security engineer or analyst, and now we have both of those, security engineer and security analyst. But what they did remove was network and cloud engineer, DevOps and software developer, IT auditors, and project managers. And the reason for that is because network and cloud engineers should be focused on things like CCNA or AWS certifications because you need to understand how to do the technology and the equipment on a command line or keyboard basis. And Security Plus was never doing a good job of that anyway. And so they realized it wasn't really meant to be in Security Plus, so they pulled that out. Also, DevOps and software development. Most of you are not going to be software developers. That's not what you want to do in life. And so they pulled that out of Security Plus because Security Plus is more about applying security principles, not creating security software. And so that's why that got removed. And then the same thing with IT auditors. The reason they removed that is because that's really work that's being done at the CISA level. It requires more in-depth experience. And so they pulled that out to make Security Plus more entry level like it should have been. And then IT project management, they removed that as well because we have a whole certification by CompTIA called Project Plus that focuses on IT project management. And that's really where you should be learning project management, not as a single objective inside of Security Plus because it was just too weak and not enough coverage. So that's why they pulled that out so they could really focus on the things you needed to do. The problem with 601, to be quite honest, is they covered way too much stuff. And so they've scoped it back down to where it should be because it went from being this entry-level cert to being this entry-level mid-range cert. And it was just confusing a lot of people who are trying to break in the industry. So they brought it back down to where it should be, which is an entry-level cybersecurity cert, not an entry-level certification. And there is a little bit of a difference there, and we'll talk more about that later as well. All right. So yes, Dioxin, I agree with you. 701, in my opinion, is less complex and less technically in detail than what you saw in 601 in some areas. In other areas, they've gone more complex, but they've really scoped it to where it makes sense, right? You're going to learn more about an SQL injection and less about software development best practices because you're not a software developer, but you are an analyst who's going to protect from SQL injections, for example. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we're going to go pretty quickly here. We're going to talk a little bit about the 5 domains at a very high level here, just so you can see what are the objectives that are being covered on this exam. So as I mentioned, the general security concepts is going to be our first one. And the general security concepts are going to be 4 domains that we're covering. And underneath those domains, there's about 30 or 40 different bullets underneath each one. But here's the top level headline, right? compare and contrast various types of security controls. So that's talking about all the different ways we can mitigate things using physical controls, logical controls, technical controls, managerial controls, administrative controls, and things like that. We're going to talk about fundamental security concepts like confidentiality, integrity, availability, hashing, and encryption, and things like that. We're also going to be talking about the importance of change management processes and how they impact security. So if I wanted to install a security update, how do I do that inside of a large organization without breaking all their systems? That's really what we're focused on there. And then we're going to talk about the importance of using cryptographic solutions. And in here, we're talking about asynchronous and symmetric and asymmetric encryption. We're also going to be talking about things like PKI. We'll be talking about digital certificates. We'll talk about hashing. We'll talk about steganography and all the other encryption concepts that used to be in security engineering. Since security engineering went away, it got moved into general security concepts. All right. And then the next one we're going to talk about is threats, vulnerabilities, and mitigations. And here we're going to talk about comparing and contrasting common threat actors and motivations, which would be, is somebody a script kiddie, an APT, a nation state, a cyber criminal, a hacker, a cracker, whatever those things are, right? And we'll talk about all those various types of actors and why they do what they do. For example, if I'm an environmentalist, I may be a hacktivist and I want to go after a logging company because I'm afraid they're killing the environment. Whereas if you're a cyber criminal, you're doing ransomware attacks because you want to make money. That's your motivation. Mine is to protect the environment. Yours is to make money. That's what we're talking about with comparing and contrasting there. Another one we'll talk about is threat vectors and attack surfaces, and then the various types of vulnerabilities. And these two objectives are really just a big laundry list, like SQL injection, buffer overflow, XML injections, file recursion, going off memory here, but there's like 30 or 40 different ones, right? And so any of the different vulnerabilities you may deal with, like file inclusions, directory traversals, all of that is covered in there. And we have essentially one video in our course for each of those attacks so you can see what they are and how you defend against them. The next one we have is given a scenario, analyze indicators of malicious activity. This is where things get a little more technical. So when we're talking about given a scenario, analyze indicators of malicious activity, they can give you 3 or 4 lines from a firewall log and say, what attack is happening? And as you read that, you'll go, oh, based on what I see, that is an SQL injection, or that is a directory traversal, or that is a remote code execution. That's what we're talking about at that level. And then we have explained the purpose of mitigation techniques used to secure the enterprise. So this is where we talk about things like, putting a web application firewall in to protect our system, our databases from an SQL injection. The other thing I want to point out as we're going through these domains real quick is notice the first couple of words in each one. Compare and contrast, explain, given a scenario. All of those tells you the level of depth that you're expected to know on the exam. So we talk about compare and contrast. We're really talking about a definition. So if I say I have a hacktivist, what is their motivation versus somebody who is a cyber criminal, we know that the difference is a hacktivist wants to protect the environment or advance their ideology, whereas a cyber criminal wants to make money. And so that's kind of the level we're talking about there. Whereas when we go to given a scenario, that's our most in-depth objectives. That's a higher level. I'm going to give you a log to analyze or a situation, and you're going to explain to me using ABCD what the right answer is based on what you're analyzing there. And so that's the difference when we talk about those. When we talk about explain, it's kind of in between. It's a little more than a definition, but it's less than analyzing a log. And so just so you kind of have an idea of like easy, medium, hard. Easy is compare and contrast or recall. Those are the 2 terms they'll use for definitional based things. Explain is more explain or summarize is kind of level 2. And then given a scenario is level 3. And that's your hardest questions. All right. The next question the next domain we're going to talk about is security architecture. And there's 4 objectives here. Compare and contrast security implications of different architecture models. So in here, they're going to talk about things like segmentation, zero trust, software-defined networks, and things like that. But again, at a basic level of a definition or a recall type compare and contrast level. We also have given a scenario. This is more in depth. Applying security principles to secure enterprise infrastructure. So that's a lot of words. And what they're really talking about is how do I configure my devices to make my network more secure? So if I put in a firewall, I may ask you a question with configure this firewall to block telnet, and then you'll use in a PBQ some drop downs and select, block from this IP range to that IP range, anything over port 23, because 23 is telnet. That's the level we're talking about with given a scenario, applying security principles. The third one we have is comparing and contrasting your concepts and strategies to protect your data. So here we're talking about things like data at rest, data in transit, data in processing. We're talking about things like TLS and SSL as we encrypt our tunnels over the internet. If you're watching this right now and you look in the upper left corner, you see that little lock next to the website address. That means you have an encrypted tunnel between you and me, so everything we're saying is only between us and nobody can eavesdrop on that conversation. And then the fourth one is explaining the importance of resilience and recovery in security architecture. And this is all about backing up and cloud-based redundancy and resiliency, continuity of operations, business continuity, disaster recovery, backup systems and generators and power and networks and all that kind of redundant communications. So that's what we'll be focused on in domain 3 there. When we go into domain 4, we're going to be talking about security operations. And this is actually the longest domain objective-wise because there's so much here. This is how do you operate on a daily basis, right? And so you can see here on the screen, given a scenario, apply common security techniques to computing resources, explain the security implications of proper hardware, software, and data asset management, explaining various activities associated with vulnerability management, explaining security alerting and monitoring concepts and tools, given a scenario, modifying your enterprise capabilities to enhance security, given a scenario, implement and maintain identity and access management. So we're talking about how do you log into a system using SSO or multi-factor authentication or the 5 types of authentication factors. We'll also be talking about given a scenario, explain the importance of automation and orchestration. So we'll be talking about things like SOAR, which is the way that we do automation orchestration at scale when we're working in a SOC, a security operations center. We'll also be talking about explaining appropriate incident response activities. So if you detect that there was phishing attempts in your organization, what are you going to do about it? That's what we're going to talk about in that type of a lesson. And then in 4.9, we're going to talk about given a scenario, using data sources to support an investigation. Now, this is probably my favorite and least favorite section of the entire course that we just filmed, because I will tell you, it's the hardest one for me to teach because they can ask you anything they want in terms of this. And when you look at this objective, there's 9 different sub-bullets, and they talk about things like firewall logs, network logs, packet captures, and other 9 different types of data sources. And so the way we attack this is that we brought up 3 or 4 examples of each type, and then I walked you through how you can read that log to identify a vulnerability and be able to identify it. So in a firewall log, here's how you know this is an SQL injection and not an XML injection. If I pull up a packet capture, you can see that there is remote callouts happening and C2 beaconing happening with a botnet. That's what we're going to be doing inside that objective. And I will tell you that is probably the hardest objective on the entire exam. And we saved that one to almost the last or second to last section of the course, because that way you have all the stuff we taught you, all the theory, and then we're going to implement it in that given a scenario. Because a lot of the objectives in 4.9 actually matches back to 2.2, which was the threats, attacks, and vulnerabilities. Like if I talk about an SQL injection, but now you can see an SQL injection, right? And a lot of these things tie together that way. The last domain we have is going to be domain 5, and this one used to be called governance, risk, and compliance. Now it's called security program management and oversight. But really, we're still talking about governance, risk, and compliance, and you can see that here. 5.1 is summarizing elements of effective security governance. So we're talking about governance policies and structures in your organization, including policies, procedures, guidelines, and things like that. We'll also talk about the elements of the risk management process. So we'll talk about how you can transfer, mitigate, avoid, or reject, transfer, mitigate, avoid, and accept the 4 different things you can do with risk. Those are the 4. We also talk about qualitative and quantitative risk assessment and how to perform that. And those kind of things are all covered in that objective. We'll also talk about explaining the processes associated with third-party risk management and risk assessment. So if you bring in an auditor and they're doing a PCI DSS compliance, what are they looking for? And how do you oversee them as somebody who works in your organization? That's what we'll be talking about in there. We'll also be talking about summarizing the elements of effective security compliance. So this is where we go into auditing and compliance structures like GDPR, PCI DSS, and other legal regulations that are important to you and your business. And then we'll talk about objective 5.5, which is explaining the types and purposes of audits and assessments. And then that includes things like penetration tests, vulnerability assessments, and things like that. And then we'll talk lastly about, given a scenario, implement security awareness practices. And they talk about things like conducting phishing training for your users. They talk about things like how do you train your users on using a password manager and password best practices and things like that. Basically, how do you do your annual cybersecurity training inside your organization? That's really what we're talking about in that last objective there. So that's our 5 domains, and you kind of have a good idea now of summarizing, explain, compare and contrast, recall, given a scenario, and what that means when you look at these objectives as you're studying for your exams. So hopefully you'll find that helpful, because that is going to apply to every certification exam you do, whether you're already Security Plus certified or going for another certification. Keep those keywords in mind, because it tells you how in depth you need to study for a particular area or objective. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is the details for the 701 exam. Now, the 701 exam did just come out on November 7th, which was last week. It's available worldwide in English right now. Later on, they're going to be adding Japanese, Portuguese, and Spanish. Those are coming over the next 6 months or so. But we only teach in English at Dion Training. So if you're taking a course with us, I do recommend you take the English version of the exam. For those of you who are speakers of a different language like Japanese, Portuguese, or Spanish, I have a lot of people who always ask, what does that exam look like if I take it in that language? Well, essentially what CompTIA does is they make the exams in English and then they translate them to those languages. And so when you take the exam in Spanish, for example, you'll have the Spanish question on the screen, and there's a button that says See Original English. So if you're somebody who did take my course to study in English and you want to take it in your native language like Spanish, you can do that. And anytime that you're not sure of the translation, you can hit See Original. It'll go back to English for you. But we don't have any Spanish materials. We only teach in English, for instance. But I have some people who ask that question. And so for me, I speak English and I'm a secondary Spanish speaker. I'm not good enough to take my exam in that. But if you're somebody who is a Spanish speaker and your secondary language is English, you may want to take it that way in Spanish, where you can then see the English as well as you're testing it and go back and forth. For the exam, it costs $392 here in 2023. Usually CompTIA does raise the price every January by 3% on their exams. So I would expect that to go just over $400 next year once we pass January 1st. But if you buy your voucher before the end of this year, it'll be $392 if you buy it direct from CompTIA. If you go to diontraining.com/vouchers, you'll get 10% off that price by buying your voucher from us. And we'll put that in the chat as well if you guys need that. Christina's doing that now, but it's diontraining.com/vouchers. And that we have all the CompTIA vouchers. You can buy them there, and they're always 10% off for you every day of the year because we train so many students. We get a bulk pricing discount, and we pass on savings to you guys. When you take the exam, you will have performance and multiple choice questions. You'll get a maximum of 90 questions, and you'll have 90 minutes to answer those questions. Your passing score on this exam is a 750 on a scale of 100 to 900 points. I will tell you, there's no equivalent like if you get a 72% you're going to pass or an 85% you're going to pass or whatever, because every question is individually scored and each one has an individual weight to it depending on how hard it is. If it's given a scenario, it may be worth 2 points. And if it's an explain question, it may be worth 1 point. If it's a performance-based question, a simulation, that may be worth 5 or 10 points. And so it's hard for me to say, hey, if you get a 70% of your practice exams, you'll do well. But if you're doing 75 to 80% of your practice exams, you should pass the real thing